The problem with this any one scenario, irrespective of the repugnant ideologies, is that it might make an individual feel fulfilled, but they're not an individual, because they, as we know, can be subsumed and be disposed of or dispensed with. So that's not a very happy scenario either. So what could we be facing? Well, the one I really want to concentrate on is what we could call the nobody scenario, which I suspect is one that is particularly going to be prevalent in this century as opposed to in the last centuries. I'm sure there's many parents here or grandparents who are concerned, as people are increasingly, by this kind of statistic, and this is from the British press, that between a child's 10th and 11th birthday, on average, here we are, 900 hours spent in class, just under 1,300 hours with their family, and look at this, just under 2,000 hours in front of a screen. Unprecedented. I would suggest to you this is unprecedented, and this is why I say the environment is changing. And of course, in the press, there's increasing concern, as these are just two randomly selected covers, one pretty old and one more recent, about the concern of what is happening to our children. Are they becoming cyborgs like this, or are they being oppressed by gadgets? Well, let's have a think about that if we explore people of the screen versus people of the book. And I think this is a very telling little quote from Kevin Kelly, a journalist. "Screen culture is a world of constant flux, of endless sound bites, of quick cuts and half-baked ideas, a flow of gossip tidbits, news headlines, floating first impressions. Notions don't stand alone but are massively intimate to everything else. And truth is not delivered by authors and authorities, but it's assembled by the audience." That's a really interesting issue. When you read a book, the authority takes you by the hand and you go on a journey. And now, it might not be a journey you like, but it's a journey where you end up in a different place cognitively to where you started. You went through a series of logical or quasi-logical steps to get to that place. Then you go on another journey, and gradually, because human beings relate one thing in terms of other things, they make connections, gradually you'll build up a conceptual framework, which, in my mind, is what we call education. It enables you to understand your world, to see a significance in the things around you, understand your culture, and then the cultures of others as you expand and read about people in other times or places through books, how things relate one to another. And that's very different from if you yourself, as they would have a 3-year-old do in the UK, learn Google, where you put the child, what kind of question are they going to ask? What kind of framework do they have? Or are they going to instead just have a premium on yuck and wow of just whatever comes on the screen? Now, there are some good things, and again, a book by Stephen Johnson argues, for example, that this screen culture promotes a higher IQ. And that doesn't surprise me, because the kind of skills rehearsed in IQ tests are very similar to computer games, where you're not needing a great knowledge of economics or history or literature, but rather to see patterns, to have a mental agility, to have a process. So that is a good thing. Some people think multitasking is a good thing. I don't know if you would like to live like this. Here we are. This is what you could be going for in the future. Let's hope we don't have to do this too much. And as some of you who have children who multitask might have suspected, you wouldn't need to see this, that it's been shown here that there's less listening with more multitasking. Perhaps some of you would testify to that. If you talk to your children while they're multitasking, they don't hear you. What concerns me hugely is statistics such as this, and I think it's the same in Australia as in England, which is the huge increase in prescriptions for attention deficit disorder. Methylphenidate is a more generic name for the drug Ritalin, prescribed for children with attentional problems. Now, it might be that the threshold for prescribing drugs has changed. It may be other factors. Or could it be that the environment is now predisposing kids in a way more now to have a shorter attention span when they're very young? I just leave that as a question. I'm not making that as a statement, but I think we owe it to the next generation to explore that possibility, if you think about it. So what are the effects of screen culture? Well, it could be that there's a shorter attention span, and for sure it's strongly sensory. That's the whole point of a screen. It's not there just having text on it. It's having strong audio-visual representation. Perhaps most notorious is World of Warcraft, which many find addictive, which has a very strong, fast-paced sensory delivery, where what you see is what you get. There's very little that stands for other things. It's a narrative. It's all action. It's not like Jane Austen here. You know, it's not thoughts or feelings or insights. This is action all the way, in increasing action. So there's no metaphor. There's no abstract concepts. If, for example, I just did this for fun. Again, I Googled on the concept of honor, which is a very interesting concept. This is what I got on, you can see this is British, obviously, because there's Prince Charles on it, Queen on it, I mean. So what would you, if you were to Google on this, would you, and how do you explain what honour was? Is it a verb? Is it a symbol? What is it? What's honour? How can you show honour literally? You can't. It's not literal. It's an abstract concept. So how are you going to get that kind of notion across? I think also we need to think about process versus content or meaning. We talked already about IQ tests and that putting the emphasis on process. But here you are, when you're playing a game to rescue the princess, as here, do you actually care about Princess Yukihime? Do you care about her? Do you care about her in the same way as you might care about Princess Maria in Tolstoy? I suggest you don't. Yeah. So, because the difference is on process versus cognitive. So again, one can then go on, if you're not interested in how someone's interrelating, as you would be if you were reading a book, might we have a reduced empathy? Well, what's very interesting is in Second Life, and I'm sure everyone is familiar with Second Life, even if you're not Vlad the Dragon Slayer yourself, that there is a reduced empathy, possibly because it's very popular with people with autism, and I'll remind you they're people who find it hard to attribute thoughts and feelings to others. And again, you're looking at an action-packed world, it's almost a Tom and Jerry world, rather than a world where people express different views and thoughts, and you kind of try and put yourself in their position. So that would then go on to what your sense of identity might be, and I think that's rather interestingly shown by the history of blogging. So we have Blogger in 1999, I just have to tell someone about the thing my cat did today. 2004, oh my God, cat pictures. YouTube, 2005, moving cat pictures, and then we have the pinnacle of civilization here, Twitter, 2007. 1 p.m, my cat just sneezed. 1:02, cat sneezed again. 1:04, cat hasn't sneezed recently, getting worried. Now, what does this remind you of? Look, Mummy, I've just put my sock on. Look, Mummy, I'm doing this. Look, Mummy, I'm doing that. Doesn't that remind you of a small child who needs constant readout to reassure themselves that they exist, that they're existing? Is this not someone in existential crisis? You know, where are you existing as a continuous entity from one? It's just a thought, just a thought. Finally, because time is short, there's risk-taking, and I think this is something very important, especially nowadays. Obama said that the current financial crisis, well, I know you don't have it here, but the rest of the world has undergone a financial crisis. We are suffering in Europe, and it's all due to greed and recklessness. Perhaps you here in Australia are neither greedy nor reckless, but let's just think about that, because it may be related to the fact that it could have been caused by this generation of young traders. If you look at risk-taking from a neurological point of view, then we ask what are the cases neurologically when people are more reckless. And it's been known for a long time that this area of the brain, the so-called prefrontal cortex, if that is damaged or it's underactive, then that will manifest itself in more reckless behavior. We know this because of a case in the 19th century of one Phineas Gage who had a bar through his head through a premature explosion, who became more reckless. He was documented by this physician here, Harlow, and this is a gory picture of what happened. You can see that it was a pretty severe wound. He lived to tell the tale and actually died of alcoholism because he earned so much money showing off his wound in the end, he could afford to take to the bottle. So, but nonetheless, the predisposing feature was he was reckless. But also, very interestingly, he noted something else as well. Intellectual manifestations were feeble, exceedingly capricious and childlike. Now, what you need to know is that the prefrontal cortex kicks in very late in your development. It will come on in late adolescence or in your early 20s. It's active, but only fully active and operational when you are quite old in neurological terms. So it's very interesting, this notion that the prefrontal cortex could be linked not just to being reckless, but to being somewhat childlike, possibly to taking the world at face value. We'll come on to that. Other people that have an underactive prefrontal cortex are schizophrenic people, due to an overactivity of the chemical dopamine, which depresses the neurons in this frontal part of the brain. Now, schizophrenic people, like children, have difficulty in interpreting proverbs. They take the world very literally. They're very easily distracted. They have a short attention span. They see the world in very sensory, glowing colours. They have a very fragile sense of self. They feel they're being imploded on often. So there are certain similarities between the schizophrenic and the child. In schizophrenia here, you can see with brain scans, the patient's lying on their back. The front bit is the prefrontal cortex, that little thing in the center that's underactive. Now, we can link that possibly with some of the behaviors of today, not least obesity. What's very interesting is that people who are obese are more reckless in gambling tasks, and moreover, that can be linked to an underactive prefrontal cortex. As you can see here, there's an inverse relationship between people with a high body mass index, that's to say people who are large compared to their height, and how active that frontal part of the brain is. Now let's put all that things together. What's very interesting, people that eat know very well the consequence of eating, but compulsive eaters carry on eating because they love the taste of the food. People that gamble, as obese people do more recklessly, know the consequence of gambling, but they still do it. They love the thrill of the adrenaline as the roulette wheel goes around or whatever. And schizophrenic people, as we can see here from this set of paintings, where in psychiatric terms at least it's deteriorating, but I think in artistic terms it's getting better. You can see there it's becoming more abstract, more sensory, less cognitive. The cat's hardly recognizable. And what I'd like to suggest is this underactive prefrontal cortex that is the common factor in these very different conditions could be characterized by a triumph of the senses over cognition. You could probably see where this is headed. So let's think about the world that's very rewarding of childhood, where you're highly aroused, say. Let's think of a world, an addictive world, where people take drugs. Let's think of a world where people find things rewarding. Now, all of these things, I would say, are typical of screen activities. And what they have in common, arousal, addiction, and reward, is this chemical dopamine, which is highly active in schizophrenia, and which, therefore, I'm arguing, could be activated and during computer games as well, and actually dampen down the prefrontal cortex. So what might be happening in the brain? Well, this is just a suggestion, but founded on facts. First, I can't see, I haven't got my glasses on here. Here we are. Intense stimulation of the screen will enable fast response because you need to be aroused and excited. This high arousal will be associated with the release of this chemical dopamine, which in turn is related to reward-seeking addictive behaviors. And when the dopamine is released, we know that it can dampen down the frontal part of the brain. And inhibition of that frontal part of the brain will be similar, comparable to conditions such as childhood schizophrenia and obesity, which in turn could be characterized by less cohesion with the rest of the brain, a more childlike state of mind, where you're reversing to a state, therefore, that is sensory rather than cognitive. And if you are after thrills and raw sensations, then screens will be appealing to you, and that will carry on in that cycle. So what I'm suggesting is there could be a link here in the brain with these modern technologies. Now, for sure, we've always done this. We've always let ourselves go. We've had a sensational time since the time of the Greeks. Here we have people whiteboard. Oh, I got this from northern Queensland, actually, and it fascinated me, that idea, that people would pay money to be out of control. That's an interesting nation. Or Fragonard Swing here, also out of control. So these different cultures, different times, show that this is endemic in human nature. We've always wanted to do this. But my fear is that the emphasis will now be shifting. So let's just briefly summarize. Two basic modes of consciousness. We can call it the mindless and the mindful. On the one hand, strong feelings. On the other hand, a more thinking way. Would call one sensory, the other cognitive. One characterized by living in the here and now, the other by having a past, a present, a future, a narrative, a sequence, the kind of narrative that you have when reading books, when you live your life, that gives you an enduring identity. You have a past, a present, and a future, as opposed to an atomized here and now. One where it's driven moment by the external environment, a strongly sensory one where internal perceptions dominate, for example, when you read a book, and you can ignore the press of the outside world. One that has little meaning, what you see is what you get. If meaning is seeing one thing in terms of another, this is simply literal, what you have is what you get. Here, a highly personalized meaning. Instead of a load of dots and nose and a mouth, it's your mother's face. It's not just a scramble of images. Here, a reduced sense of self, you've let yourself go. Here, a strong sense of identity. This characterized, by excessive infants and children, where there's excessive dopamine. Here, older children and adults with lower dopamine. This being what happens with prefrontal activation, and this with fully active prefrontal cortex. Now, of course, we have both, and we can do both. We always have done. But what I fear is that the screen technologies will shift us to the left-hand column more frequently, or perhaps almost as the default condition compared to the right. So it's not so much that we're going to become cyborgs, but I think we might be infantilizing the brain, keeping the brain in a childlike state that has no meaning where you're living for the moment. So, now let's go back. So for the first time, could the mind be radically changed? Well, let's just think about that. Well, the scenarios I've painted, I think, although they seemed bad, in moderation are good. It's very nice to win the Nobel Prize, to be a someone. It's nice to be nobody, to let yourself go, whether it's skiing or wine or women or whatever it is, or song, to actually have a sensational time. Similarly, it's nice to be anyone, to be part of a team, where you are sublimating your individual caprices for the greater good. But we all do this as a portfolio of human activity rather than just any one thing. It's all a question of balance. What I haven't mentioned that fascinates me very much as a fourth option, and that is being creative. Now, you don't want to be creative all the time, because you'd be rather kind of self-centered and eccentric, but that aha moment is how an individual, I think, can fulfill themselves better than owning a handbag that's as individual as you are. So I think it's a question of getting the balance right, of understanding the new technologies, but making them work for us to deliver that whole range of someone, no one, anyone, and dare I say it, eureka. My session is over. This is a shameless plug, for I've said this in a less garbled way, available on Amazon and I think in Australia too. Thank you very much.